Seminars so far this term have been consistently focusing on Syria, to my own delight, of course. And the past couple of sessions, we focused mostly on the topic of political economy. Now, I think today's seminar is very much consistent with the thematic progression that we've had so far, specifically regarding how, with the devolution of economic authority in Syria, came a degree of devolving social authority as well, specifically in the context of post-2000 neoliberal economic turn. So today's speaker, Dr. Ruiz de Elvira, I am very familiar with her work through my graduate studies. Very lucky to have you here with us today. The focus on religious associations and more specifically charity organizations, I believe, opened a new perspective, state study perspective that, in my opinion, broke the hegemony, as I was telling you earlier, of state-centric approaches to Syrian studies, a much-needed alternative in a way. So Dr. Laura is a permanent researcher at the French Institut de Recherche pour le Développement. She holds a double degree in political science and Arabic. And her discussion today is based on a 2-year fieldwork in Syria between 2007 and 2010. She explores themes of social engineering, the erosion of political legitimacy, and the 2011 uprisings in Syria. So, Dr. Laura, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to come here and to go back to my PhD work that I haven't really worked on the last years. So for me, it's an honor to be here in your university and to visit for the first time Budapest. So my talk, it's called Bashar al-Assad's Political Engineering and the Rupture of the Social Contract, 2000-2010, a glimpse through the prism of the charitable sector. The slogan of Bashar al-Assad's first years in power back in the 2000s was change based on continuity. That change of the slogan materialized in the second half of the decade, on the one hand, in the form of a partial opening of the economy and the civic sector, as well as in an important growth of charitable associations to which former public social responsibilities were outsourced. On the other hand, however, new tools of control, disciplinarization, co-optation, and repression were conceived and put into practice. In the PhD dissertation that I started in 2007 and I finished in 2013, I have analyzed the nature and the implications of that change for Syrian authoritarianism and social policies. And I have done it through the prism of the charitable sector, as you explained, which was the biggest and the most important within Syrian civil society prior to the 2011 uprising. So what I'm going to present to you today are the results of this research. And it's based, as you said, on a 2-year fieldwork that I conducted between October 2007 and January 2010, mainly in Damascus, but also in Aleppo and some small cities like Ma'lula or Tadmur, Palmyra, and also in Tartus, thanks to a scholarship that was given to me at that moment by the French Institute, l'Institut Français du Proche-Orient. My presentation will highlight the main characteristics of what I have called Bashar al-Assad's political engineering. I will divide it into 3 parts. In the first one, I will tackle the question of the revival of Syrian civil society and that of the flourishing of charitable associations. In the second one, I will show how the civic sector was nevertheless controlled, disciplinarized, co-opted and repressed by Syrian authorities. And finally, in the third part, I will argue that subcontracting poor relief measures to charities and non-state actors eroded the regime's political legitimacy, broke the prevailing post-colonial social contract, and helped sow the seeds of the 2011 uprising. But before I start, let me explain to you what Charities meant in the Syrian pre-revolutionary context. In Syria, Charities have traditionally been the mainstay of associations. Their roots date back to the Ottoman period. The first Muslim charity to see the light of day in the Bilad al-Sham region, al-Maqasid, was founded in Beirut in 1978, and before 2011 had branches in several Syrian cities. However, it postdates the first Christian Syrian charity, l'Association Saint-Vincent de Paul, which was created in 1863 in Damascus. Therefore, the charities that proliferated in the country in the years 2000 can be considered as a prolongation of a long tradition of beneficence, both Muslim and Christian. Their historical, ideological, sociological, and political foundations were essentially based on a denominational, political, geographic, and often clientele-oriented structure, and their evolution along the 20th century was intrinsically linked to the country's political and social history. Before March 2011, the Syrian charitable sector made up over 60% of all Syrian associations accredited by the state, and it was characterized by heterogeneity. Its fields of activity were extremely varied, to traditional charitable activities such as looking after the orphans and the elderly, supporting poor families, providing medical care, or financing religious education, were added from 2004 on projects of a new kind seeking to integrate a development dimension. Among the latter were assistance for young couples wishing to marry, countering unemployment through training courses and launching for-profit activities, the eradication of begging using centers to help people get back into the job market, literacy and IT courses for illiterate mothers, and the granting of microcredits. Clearly, charitable associations were learning to adapt and to seize the moment. The line between charity and development became blurred and gave way to new hybrid organizations. Before the uprising, these social structures responded to a real need on the part of the population. They were the manifestation of a fragile civil society shaped by its difficult relationship with the state. And by no means were they inactive, empty shells intended merely to collect funds from international sponsors or the Syrian state. Actually, international sponsors had many difficulties in financing them because everything needed to be approved by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor, and what the Syrian state gave to them was a very tiny amount that was also varying depending on the relations these associations had with the regime. Whilst trying to escape, circumvent, or use in their own profit their restrictions, pressures, and disciplinary mechanisms imposed by the Ba'athist regime, Syrian charities seem to have succeeded in creating some leeway within a very restrictive political system and were far from being puppets of the regime. They were based on both the strong and the weak ties, that is, the ties established via the mosques or the churches, the souk, the community, the family, rather than on a social or an ideological basis. They adopted a non-institutionalized networking system, hard to discern. They choose low visibility and publicity in order to avoid the regime's fears and suspicion, they finance their programs with private donations, tabarruat, and through the launching of for-profit activities. And finally, they elaborated a whole discourse away from politics and militancy, something that allowed them to mobilize people while at the same time not alarming the regime. These strategies, together with their social action, provided them with significant legitimacy and credibility among the population. However, their leaders were not allowed to overstep the red lines imposed by the regime. In fact, while the two Hirschmanian strategies of exit and loyalty were viable, deploying an open voice strategy was not possible for those actors who sought to root their activities durably on the ground, as we have seen with the Damascus Spring of the year 2000 or with the 2011 uprising. Yet, this docility and compliance did not mean a sincere support or the belief in the regime's ideology, as Lisa Wedin has showed in her book Ambiguities of Domination, Politics, Rhetoric, and Symbols in Contemporary Syria. Syrians tended to act as if, as she has coined, act as if they accepted and believed the regime's rhetoric, thereby producing a politics of public dissimulation in which they acted as if they revered the leader, whereas the real belief was much weaker. Forms of resistance only appeared as silent practices and choices that were not easy to perceive. In the charitable sector, for instance, it was about supporting one association rather than another, or about not taking part in the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor events, or choosing not to network with the First Lady organizations. Against this background, charities seem to be a relevant subject for analysis in Bashar al-Assad Syria. I consider, as the French sociologist Jean-Louis Laville, that the plasticity and the adaptability of the associative phenomenon endow it with a status of societal analyzer, revealing the tensions of each period. So for me, charities as a vital part of Syrian civil society could also be used as a tool to read the larger transformations that were taking place around them. And yet studies on these kind of associations were quite rare. When I started my PhD in 2007, the literature had rather focused on what it's called new generation NGOs, both developmental and advocacy ones, which were generally more visible in the eyes of foreign donors. Since then, however, partly because of the visible revival, but also because of the significant contribution to social welfare of charities in the Arab countries, recent years have witnessed a renewed interest in this type of traditional associative structures. So let me now move on and start with the first part of my presentation. In my PhD dissertation, I have shown that the Syrian regime, which was economically and politically exhausted when Bashar al-Assad took power in the year 2000, managed to reproduce itself during 1 decade thanks to a new political engineering. This political engineering, inclusive and exclusive at the same time, extremely risky, consisted in withdrawing the state from several sectors that it used to control before, whilst redeploying it in other fields that were considered as vital. Thus, at the beginning of the 21st century, responsibility for development became, for the first time in Ba'athist Syria, multilateral. Non-state actors, such as charities, were urged by the authorities to play a new role, and to strongly contribute to the national development process. The 10th five-year plan, which went from 2006 to 2010, for instance, openly called on both the private sector and civil society to contribute to the societal transformation. I quote, "The transition to social market economy will certainly require forging a new social contract among the vital forces in the Syrian society. These are comprised of the state, private sector, and civil society organizations bounded through healthy dialogue and interactive participation in formulating and implementing the five-year plan. Such partnership is the only road to win the societal transformation and meet the associated challenges." End of quote. In this new context, although public authorities repeatedly declare their wish to see the traditional charities evolve toward a more developmental structures, charities became a partner of the state. They call them partner. As compared to development, cultural, and obviously advocacy organizations, charities were indeed actively favored at that period. Like in other countries of the region, the enlargement of their responsibility was organized by the state itself through different channels. Amongst them were the privatization or denationalization of several formerly state-managed structures, the sale or the transfer of public land to charities at preferential prices, and the signature of the so-called عقود تشاركية, the association agreements. Through these agreements, the maintenance, the management, and often the financing of certain public institutions, such as the schools, health centers, and other welfare structures for orphans, passed into the hands of certain charities in order to, I quote, better guarantee a good service to the population and share welfare responsibilities between the public and the private sector. End of quote. The principle of cooperation and partnership, تشاركية, with civil society, on which the 10th five-year plan was supposed to be based, went in this way from words to deeds. All these measures were based on a logic of partial offloading or outsourcing by the states, affecting both the private and the charitable sector. The real impact of this logic, although difficult to grasp, can be illustrated by the growing volume of services offered by charities during this period, as well as by their growing number of beneficiaries and budgets. For example, the number of beneficiaries of the Damascene Amal al-Ghad, Tomorrow's Hope, founded in 2004 to support handicapped children, surged from 35 in 2005 to 207 in 2009. More spectacular was the evolution of the Sunduq al-Afiyeh, the health fund, a project of the Damascene Charities Union, اتحاد الجمعيات الخيرية بدمشق, whose number of beneficiaries increased almost ninefold, from 536 in 1997 to 4,455 in 2006. During one decade, this initiative paid for the medical care of almost 30,000 sick people, including 60,000 surgical treatments, with a total cost of 953 million Syrian pounds, which at that period was more or less 19 million US dollars. The number of beneficiaries of Sunduq al-Mawadda wal-Rahma, the Love and Mercy Fund, also belonging to the Damascus Charities Union, increased from 44 in 1999 to more than 550 in 2007. So This is just a very small examples. I have many others in my thesis that really show that there was a surge in the number of charities, in the number of beneficiaries, and in their budgets. This outsourcing policy was thought as a solution to the decrease of the state's resources, and implied the multiplication and the shifting of the state's points and forms of intervention through new mechanisms and arrangements. In fact, contrary to the hypothesis that consider that the rise of the associative actors and structures involved automatically a retreat of the state, I have rather shown in my dissertation that the processes of negotiation and interweaving that enable the Syrian state to preserve its capacities of control and its centrality in policy making. These processes reveal the permeability of several dichotomic categories, such as public versus private, or political versus economical, or state versus civil society, which is a sign, according to the French political scientist Béatrice Hibou, of an increasing décharge de l'État, like outsourcing of the state or privatization of the state. And here the case of the Jamaat al-Bustan al-Khairiyya charity, which was established in 1999 by Rami Makhlouf, and of its multiple agreements with the Syrian Ministry of Health, are a good example of what I'm saying and illustrate clearly the interpenetration of the three different circles: the charitable, the economic, and the political. Before 2011, this important charity, which could be considered as being part of Syrian civil society, administrated and financed several public social institutions and hospitals in the Latakia region. It was funded with private money, but, as we all know, the spectacular enrichment of its principal benefactor and founder, the entrepreneur Rami Makhlouf, was due to the liberalization of the national economy and to the use of his relationships with Syrian regime members. And finally, the links between the founder of the charity and the Syrian states and regime were more than evident, since Rami Makhlouf is the cousin of Bashar al-Assad. The permeability of these dichotomic categories can thus be considered rather as a point of entry to observe the redeployment of the state in Bashar al-Assad Syria rather than its retreat beyond the mere privatization of development. In sum, far from those who either denied the existence of civil society in Syria or reduced it to several structures promoted by the First Lady, or affirmed that it was completely subservient to the regime, my research shows its dynamism and variety before the uprising. Yet the relation of these charities with politics was by force ambiguous and not explicit. On the one hand, they contributed to perpetuate the status quo in the sense that they did not challenge, they didn't challenge it, and they maintained the social cohesion of the population. And by providing welfare to the poorest and the needy, they prevented social protest and mobilization from taking place. Because during the years 2000 in Syria, in contrast with what we saw in Egypt, Tunisia, or Morocco, there were no real significant social movements or protests. On the other hand, however, they did produce sometimes invisible political changes, since they created spaces where civic learning was possible and where citizens elaborated autonomous projects and negotiated them with the authorities. They increased the social capital of their staff, founders and members. They became essential in the implementation of public policies, and finally they displayed the failure of the Ba'athist development policies. Nevertheless, as we all know, the partial and controlled opening of the associative field in the years 2000 that I have just described, as well as the consequent reinforcement of social actors' role, didn't imply the end of the authoritarian system of rule in Syria. These processes were rather the expression of a new version of authoritarianism, qualified by some as post-populist, by others as neoliberal or even almost competitive. The expansion of the charitable sector was indeed accompanied by the attempt to upgrade the mechanisms that permitted the state institutions and the regime to regulate, control, and disciplinarize their activities and members. Furthermore, state policies remain ambiguous and changing depending on the evolution of the regional and the national context. For example, in 2008, when Bashar al-Assad came into the international sphere, partly thanks to Nicolas Sarkozy, who invited him to the défilé on the 14th of July, at that moment, there was a new closure of the civic sphere. One of these mechanisms of control and disciplinarization was the normalization process of pre-existing informal networks that the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor launched in 2004. By this process, dozens and probably hundreds of previous informal associations, most of them charities, registered with that ministry. This arguably resulted from the desire to eliminate spaces that were not under the state's surveillance. In fact, once those activities were registered with the ministry, the security apparatus, together with the employees of this ministry, could more easily control and direct them as they became visible structures. Manipulation and influencing them then became possible, as by being legalized, they also tacitly accepted the rules of the game. Quinten Viktorovich has observed the same mechanism in Jordan, or what he calls social control. He describes how organizations, once they are legally registered in this country, find themselves, and I quote, embedded in a web of bureaucratic practices and legal codes, which allows those in power to monitor and regulate collective activities. In this article he wrote in 2000, where he stated that promoting civil society was a way of promoting social control also. In Syria, in the years 2000, these bureaucratic practices could be permissions needed to organize an excursion or an activity, or to collect donations, or to organize a conference, or to change of activity, or to expand the headquarters. Or also it could be like regular visits made by the employees of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor to associations. And they were not forced to inform in advance. They could just jump in, pass by to the associations and control them. Linked to this, I can also mention the strengthening of the role of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor, which became a central institution in the daily life of associations. This ministry opened a new section, which was exclusively in charge of dealing with the association's affairs. According to Dial El-Haj Aref, the former Minister of Social Affairs and Labor, the role of this ministry was not anymore to give material or financial support to associations, but rather to plan and dictate the general lines that should be followed by them, and to coordinate and harmonize the different projects they undertook. It was a role of Ishraf, supervising, and mutaba'a, monitoring. That's what she used to say. Another mechanism of control and disciplinarization was the creation of several gongos, governmental organized NGOs, linked to the First Lady and to other authorities, such as Dial al-Hajj Arif. These gongos could be considered as semi-public institutions and were arguably meant to fill the existing gaps by helping to link state and society, in addition to their other functions such as securing international donors' money, increasing international donors' money, disciplining the associative field by dictating the rules to follow and the sectors that should be invested, and conveying a modern and professional image to the world of a new couple, a new presidential couple that was wishing to open Syria to the world. As one Syrian consultant put it, this elite civil society is given a certain freedom because one major problem in our society is that nobody is able to communicate between society and the state. Party and official civil society are dysfunctional. That's what this person said. In a few years, these gongos managed to monopolize certain economic, educational, and cultural activities and networks in a quasi-corporatist fashion, thereby reproducing patterns of authoritarian rule while pretending to further civic pluralism. And actually, it worked quite well. When you would talk to the staff of the European Commission, for instance, they seemed to be quite attracted to the presidential couple, while they would be very much critical, for instance, with Dial al-Hajj Arif, which was supposed to be the old guard controlling the ministry. So there was a sort of good cop, bad cop play also. Finally, the uqud tasharukiya that I mentioned before could also be considered as an instrument of control of these associations and as a channel for the state to redeploy itself. But regime's domination over social actors was also exerted via explicit repressive and coercive measures that aim ultimately at strengthening the state's control over charitable activities as well as over Islamic movements, and in some cases at punishing actors who had crossed the red lines. And I will just point out very briefly 3 of them. The prohibition of the Mawaid al-Rahmah or Mawaid al-Rahman, tables of mercy, which is public fast breaking where food was provided for the poor. The removal of religious individuals from the charities boards. And finally, the dissolution of charities boards. In August 2008, the recently appointed Minister of Religious Endowments, Mohammed Abdel Sattar al-Sayed, announced the end of the era of anarchy. In this framework, he took 2 important decisions regarding the charitable activities in Syria. First, he forbade charities and mosques to hold the Mawaid al-Rahmah during Ramadan. These events, which had become very successful in previous years in Syria, as in other countries of the region like Lebanon or Egypt, were financed by rich merchants and famous charities. In 2006, for instance, the Hifz al-Ni'mah Association, which was the biggest association in Damascus and almost in one of the biggest in Syria. So Hifz al-Ni'mah had offered the iftar, the fast breaking, to 10,000 people in the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus via the project Iftar al-Sa'im. And you could see there are still some images of people waiting and doing the queue outside the mosque. It was very impressive. The reasons the reasons the Ministry of Religious Endowments gave for prohibiting these events were confusing and officiously linked to the desire of protecting the mosques from being dirtied and profaned with these kind of practices. Furthermore, the authorities argued both that the people benefiting from these tables were not poor people, but rather profiteers, and that the zakat, and the alms giving, and sadaqah, the voluntary giving, were meant to be paid in secret and not publicly. Yet, in reality, this decision resulted mainly from the determination to prevent merchants, rich businessmen, and religious men from using these public celebrations for their own benefit, namely in terms of notability, visibility, and publicity, as well as from the will to stop collective mass gatherings. That is the reason why although the Mawaid al-Rahmah were indeed forbidden at that moment, charities were actually allowed to keep on distributing iftar individually. Instead of eating the iftar collectively in the public space, in the mosque or in the square or in the street, the beneficiaries were given doggy bags to take food home. And during the Ramadan of the year 2010, for instance, the charity Hifz al-Ni'amah, again, distributed more than 22,000 meals per day to the destitute families of Damascus. The second episode arrived at the end of 2008. It was decided that anyone working on a clerical role, such as imams, prayer leaders, mosques, prayer leaders at mosques, and teachers at religious institutions. So those people were compelled to step down from any official post they might hold in a charitable institution. In fact, as Thomas Pierret and Jetil Selvik described in their article of 2009, on September 27, a car bombing killing 17 in a suburb of Damascus provided the ministry with the opportunity to widen the scope of its plan by imposing complete ministerial control over private Sharia institutes and dismissing the country's Muslim clerics, including Saria and Osama al-Rifai from Hifz al-Ni'amah Association, from the Charitable Association's boards of directors. Substitutes were chosen by the authorities from lists of 3 candidates that each of the concerned ulama was asked to provide. These candidates, chosen by the clerics among their loyal clients, had to be secular. Thus, while historically clerics had always been heads of charitable initiatives in Syria, in 2008, they found themselves suddenly banned from practicing this activity, at least legally. Salah Kaftaru, for instance, the former administrator of the Sheikh Ahmed Kaftaru Foundation, chose the engineer Mohannad Aloush, married to his niece, to replace him at the head of the Jama'at al-Ansar al-Khairiyah, which belongs to that foundation. Furthermore, while Muslim religious men were then dismissed from their positions at the head of Muslim charities, Christian associations were still allowed to remain legally under the patronage of the church, and some of them were even presided by Christian religious leaders. So there was always an uneven way or not equal way of dealing with Christian charities and Muslim charities. And this could be seen at many levels. The reasons of this decision, from which the government never backed down, were clearly linked to the regime's desire to prevent Sunni religious men from increasing their social capital, their influence, and their visibility via those charities. Finally, I can also mention another measure that was taken by the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor from time to time, that is the decision to dissolve a charities board of directors. This practice was authorized by the law 93 of 1958, that is the law of associations, قانون الجمعيات الخيرية والمؤسسات, which established that the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor could dissolve the board of any charity at any moment. In June 2009, for instance, the board of directors of the Aleppo Charities Union, which had been founded in 1961, was dissolved one day before its re-election. It was replaced by a temporary board designated by the minister Dial al-Hajj Araf. And by this decision, the ministry actually canceled the annual meeting of this union, thus preventing it from choosing a new independent board. And the members of the new board, who were still on duty in 2011, were chosen by the ministry among regime-friendly candidates. So those three examples prove, from my point of view, that besides reinforcing the work and the role of charities, the Syrian regime equally tried to limit their autonomy and the strengthening of this sector by putting important restrictions to its activities and, in some occasions, by sidelining regime-hostile personalities. Lastly, along with the physical and institutional coercive practices like arrest, dissolutions, as I just said, softer and more diffuse modalities of domination and persuasion were employed, like co-opting certain actors, the foreign educated returnees, the merchants, the businessmen, some NGO leaders, some religious leaders, or by launching joint programs with civil society organizations that would then become compliant partners. In sum, the state-civil society relation in Bashar al-Assad Syria was one characterized by a double dialectic. On the one hand, the need to promote non-state actors because of their important contribution to development and social welfare, and on the other hand, the need to restrict and control these actors in order to preserve the supremacy of the regime. Therefore, periods of relative openness and relaxation towards charitable organizations were always interrupted by repressive measures whenever needed. Let me now enter my third and final part. In my dissertation and in several articles, I have argued that the socio-political transformations of Bashar al-Assad Syria that I have highlighted here, that is the growth of the associative field as a result of altered state-society relations, the partial economic liberalization, and the outsourcing of social responsibility. So these transformations indicate that the tacit and inclusive social contract, which was established between the Syrian regime and various social forces about 5 decades ago, had undergone a far-reaching renegotiation and redefinition in the years 2000. In Hafez al-Assad Syria, political efforts centered on developing rural areas and public sector institutions, as well as on improving peasants' and workers' living conditions. Although al-Assad Senior cooperated with the merchant class more fully than had his more radical Ba'athist predecessors of the 60s, he never marginalized populist constituencies to the same degree that Bashar al-Assad would. Hafez al-Assad had already reduced the significance of the social contract, especially during the last years of his rule, but under his son, attempts were made to forge a new social contract, as reflected in the 10th five-year plan, and I quoted a part of it, a fragment of it. And both policies and rhetoric changed significantly. The focus largely shifted to Syria's main cities, Damascus and Aleppo, and to the private sector. A more selective approach privileging bourgeois and upper middle class segments of society was adopted. Through discourse about social responsibility, participation, partnership, the state tried to co-opt entrepreneurs and professionals, as well as civil society and religious actors. And the old corporatist organizations were put aside and dwarfed by the First Lady Gongos, mainly the Syria Trust for Development, that despite their success, could not fill the gap. In the Syrian regime, if the Syrian regime intended to use charitable action in order to win the hearts and minds of a wider population, it failed. Charities' expansion and assumption of new responsibilities, even if not sufficient to take up the whole burden of social services, reflected the outsourcing and selling off of the state's responsibility to the poor. Actually, the larger the role of charities became, the more visible it was that the regime had abandoned the old social contract. Even if charities had been capable of mitigating Syria's rising poverty, by 2010, the retreat of the state from social services was obvious. Although the state certainly remained the dominant agent of redistribution and the main provider of social welfare, non-state actors became increasingly important in ensuring economic growth and social welfare provision to a growing and impoverished population. In other words, the fact that the Syrian regime welcomed and supported charities and other benevolent actors did not mean that it became more interested in the poor or in pro-poor politics, but on the contrary, that it became less willing to engage in providing welfare, instead commissioning this task to trustworthy, that is, loyal or apolitical non-state actors. Therefore, it is not only the new modern-looking gongos which first come to mind when talking about authoritarian upgrading that demonstrate both the significant transformation of Syrian society and the attempts by the regime to keep a close lid on politics. Even more pointedly, the developments in the traditional charitable sector reflected profound political, economic, and social changes that fueled popular discontent and helped to provoke the at first peaceful and then defiant and eventually violent uprising. In that sense, Bashar and al-Asad did not manage the poor, so to say, of Syria. The old social contract crumbled, and the poor were mostly left out of new Gongos initiatives. Thus, the Syrian uprising that began in March 2011 suggests that unraveling the old social contract was a fatal error on the regime's part. As Raymond Hennebusch writes, the outbreak of the uprising proves indeed that each short-term gain for the regime from such techniques of rule entailed cumulative long-term costs. Already when the Arab uprisings had started in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, the Syrian leadership seemed to realize, at least to a certain extent, that its neoliberal and outsourcing policies had gone too far and began to reanimate the old social contract. For instance, in February 2011, the long-awaited National Social Aid Fund was launched, the goal of which was to, and I quote, protect and nurture targeted individuals and families through providing regular and emergency aid, to enable the beneficiaries economically, socially, and in the fields of health and education, and to promote development and investment in human capital. The government also raised civil servants' salaries and promised to further increase subsidies. Furthermore, Abdel al-Dardari, former director of the State Planning Commission and the main architect of the 10th five-year plan, was dismissed from his influential position as Deputy Prime Minister of Economic Affairs, and agriculture was rediscovered as the most important economic sector. Yet, these measures, coupled with relentless repression, turned out to be too little and too late. The exclusionary measures of the 2000s were indeed sweeping and altered the very core of Syrian state-society relations. Hence, the above-mentioned political engineering, although it seemed efficient in the short term, it also contributed to weakening al-Assad's regime in the sense that it caused both the rupture of the social contract and that of the authoritarian balance. Thank you.